What would you do if a stranger knocked on your door in the middle of the night? Would you trust them, or would you sense that something was off? Amelia thought she knew what to expect when she let a lost traveler into her home. But what happened next will make you question everything. It was a quiet evening in a small village in England, where the wind whispered through the trees and the last rays of sunlight slowly faded away. Amelia, a young woman in her mid-20s, had always preferred the peaceful isolation of her family's countryside home. It was a charming house, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, far from the noise and distractions of the city. Amelia had grown accustomed to the solitude, and though it was a peaceful life, it sometimes left her with an aching emptiness she couldn't quite explain. One evening, as Amelia sat by the fireplace, she heard a knock at the door. Who could it be at this hour? She rose from her chair and walked towards the door. Opening it slowly, she found a man standing on the porch. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark, piercing eyes and an unsettling calmness about him. "I'm sorry to bother you, miss," he said in a smooth, almost melodic voice. "I've lost my way and was hoping to find shelter for the night. My car broke down, and the storm seems to be getting worse." Amelia hesitated, but something about his presence intrigued her. She'd never been one to turn away a stranger, and the storm outside seemed to be growing fiercer. "Of course you may come in," she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. The man smiled faintly, his gaze briefly lingering on her before stepping inside. His clothes were wet from the rain, and he looked exhausted. Amelia led into the sitting room, offering him a seat by the fire. "I'm Richard." The man introduced himself, settling into the chair. "Thank you for your kindness." Amelia smiled, trying to ignore the strange feeling that seemed to settle in her chest. She offered him a cup of tea, and they began to chat. Richard told her he was just passing through the area, on his way to visit a relative who lived nearby. His story seemed simple enough, and for a while, the conversation flowed easily. However, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Richard's eyes seemed to follow Amelia's every move, his gaze unsettling and intense. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, studying her. She brushed it off as paranoia. After all, it was late, and she wasn't used to having company. But then strange things started happening. The house, which had always felt like a safe haven, suddenly felt different. Doors creaked when there was no one near them, and the air seemed colder than it had been before. Amelia tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. At around midnight, she excused herself to go upstairs to her bedroom, leaving Richard alone in the sitting room. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. A loud, sharp sound echoed through the house. Was that a scream? Her heart raced as she slowly made her way back down the stairs, her breath shallow. She reached the living room, and what she saw next sent a chill down her spine. Richard was standing by the window, his back to her. His hands were pressed against the glass, staring out into the dark night. He didn't turn when she entered the room, didn't acknowledge her presence. There was something wrong. His posture was unnervingly stiff, as though he were no longer human. "Richard?" she called softly. He didn't respond. A feeling of dread washed over her, and she took a cautious step forward. The silence in the house was deafening. Amelia's heart was pounding in her chest as she stepped closer to the man. Suddenly, Richard spun around to face her, and what she saw made her blood run cold. His eyes were now completely black, as if the whites had vanished. His expression was no longer calm, but twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. "You should never have let me in," Richard whispered, his voice no longer smooth but ragged, like a broken whisper. Amelia stumbled backward, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. She could barely breathe as she realized that the man she had welcomed into her home was not who he appeared to be. Before she could react, Richard lunged forward, his hands outstretched toward her. The door behind her slammed open on its own, and she stumbled backward into the stormy night, narrowly avoiding his grasp. Amelia ran, her breath ragged as she bolted into the rain-soaked woods. But there was something more. Amelia could hear Richard's voice in the distance, faintly calling her name, growing louder with each step she took. "Why won't he leave me alone?" she thought as her feet splashed through puddles, her heart beating wildly. Suddenly, she found herself stumbling upon a hidden clearing in the woods, an old, decrepit graveyard she had never seen before. The gravestones were weathered, but one in particular caught her attention. It was fresh, newly carved with the name Richard Grayson and the dates of death marked as 1965. Richard. Her heart froze. Amelia looked around. The storm had stopped, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. She turned to run, but Richard was there, standing silently behind her. "You should have never come here," he whispered. Richard wasn't a lost traveler, but a ghost who had been haunting the area for decades. The reason Richard hadn't aged or left was because Amelia's home stood on a cursed piece of land, his final resting place. Lesson: being kind to strangers can sometimes be a dangerous choice, especially when you invite them into your life without knowing their true identity. Trust your instincts and don't ignore the signs, no matter how harmless something seems at first. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like Amelia's? Would you have trusted the stranger, or would you have been more cautious? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories.